Welcome to everybody who's came in person and fought through the Aloha Friday traffic to come for our session tonight. And of course, to all of our Zoom viewers too. First, I'd like to thank the following people for their continuing support of this program. The late Dr. Al Bloom, the founder of this series that is in its 24th year. And in remembrance and appreciation of his mentor, Kenko Futaba, and our remembrance and appreciation of Al, as our mentor. Also want to thank his wife, Dorothy Nell Bloom, and she's on Zoom tonight, as well as some of her family members, Lily and Ross might be on tonight too, because she's continuing to be a co-founder of the program. I'd like to also thank my wife, Faye Mar, who's been a co-convener for the many years that we've been helping out in this. Dr. George Tanabe, respondent extraordinaire, a fixture with our Bloom-Futaba. Rimbam Yuika Hasebe for having this at the Betsuin, along with our executive director, John Matsuoka, and of course, Dave Atchison, our audiovisual wizard and jack of all trades around the Hawaii Betsuin. This year, we have a special treat in having Professor Vanessa Sasson share her books, Yaśodharā and the Buddha, and The Gathering, plus behind the scenes perspectives on creating novels based on academic research. Our longtime friend and respondent, George Tanabe, will help facilitate our discussion. Vanessa was inspired to an academic career in religion by a vacation visit to Nepal that turned into a year-long stay and a lifelong affection for Himalayan history and culture. She's also a karate enthusiast who kind of embarrassing, right? Who enjoys the transformative experience of dissolving the self and exploring the inner vastness beyond the self. Now, welcome Professor Sasson on her very first visit to Hawaii.
Thank you. Aloha. And thank you, Dex, for the best introduction I've had at a book talk in a long time. Thank you for being here, and thank you for those of you who are on Zoom. And thank you to George, who I'm so glad is here sitting next to me, and to BDK and to this lecture series. I'm very glad to be here. And Hawaii is so pretty. You're so lucky. Everybody I meet here, I'm just thinking, wow, you get to live here. My country's very cold. So what I thought I would do is tell you a little bit of the story of Yaśodharā. My experience over the years since I've written this book, the first of the two books, is that we tend to know the story of the Buddha. We have a feel for it. We know he was a prince. We know he left home. He did his great departure. He saw the four sights, right? So we know the skeleton of the story. But my experience over the years of doing these kinds of talks is that people don't always know. It's loud. Oh, no, it's okay. My experience has been that most people don't always know the details of the story and don't always know the other characters in the Buddha's story. And so Yaśodharā is a really important character, and she's all over the literature. She's everywhere. And yet we somehow have deleted her. And so every textbook, every introduction to Buddhism, I see people write about Buddhism, and for the longest time, it's like she's not part of the picture, or she's there, but she's a token. So she's just, he was married, he left her, and the story goes on. And so that's all we get of that part of the story. I've done talks in different parts of the Buddhist world where people just stop and say, wait, hold on. The Buddha had a wife? And there's like that moment where like, oh yeah, that's right, he left her. But that's all the piece of the story that people seem to carry. What is amazing is that Buddhist literature, the Buddhist stories, the Buddhist sources have so much to say about her. She's actually a really important character. We've just somehow not brought her with us. into the contemporary world. We left her behind. And so part of me writing this book is to bring her back. So I'm not inventing her story. I'm recalling it, which I think is really important. And I'm trying to give her some space in our collective imagination. So when I first started writing this book, like with anyone who writes a book, you start by, well, I don't know actually how everybody else does it, but as an academic, you start by reading everything you can get your hands on and building up your repertoire. And I came across something that I did not expect to find. I was looking for all the places where I could find Yaśodharā, and I was collecting it all to figure out how am I going to build a narrative with all the pieces that I'm going to collect. And I found one piece that became the heart of the story for me, because I didn't quite know what to do with her at first. I knew I wanted to tell her story, but how to tell her story, and what's the feeling of this woman who was married to the man who becomes the Buddha. And so one of the things I looked at are these things called Jataka stories, which many of you probably have some feeling for, but just in case, I'll explain a little bit what it is. The way the Buddhist imagination of the cosmos works is that we're in samsara. And so there's this cycle of death and rebirth and death and rebirth. And we're just going from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime, and we can be doing this forever unless we choose to escape samsara. Right? And if there's anything I'm saying that you want clarification or you want to interrupt me, I come from a Middle Eastern background. We interrupt each other all the time. So you're welcome to interrupt me and I'll be very comfortable. So this notion of samsara is really prevalent and important to the way Buddhists tell their stories. I think there was somebody who was trying to get in. And the Jataka stories are stories of the Buddha in his past lives. And we have hundreds of these stories. They're all over Buddhist writing. So we have East Asian ones, we have Thai ones, we have Sri Lankan ones. We have them from all over the Buddhist world. Is these stories that communities imagined about who the Buddha would have been in a past life. And so sometimes he's a crocodile, and sometimes he's a bird, and sometimes he's a rat, and sometimes he's a thief. Now she's stuck outside. Oh, no. She has a key. So there's all these life stories that the Buddha has had in his past life. When I was going through the Jatakas and I was looking at them again and trying to read them with a fresh perspective, I realized something that I had never registered before, is that the way Jataka stories work, if you haven't read them before, is that it starts in the present. So somebody's talking to the Buddha and they will ask him a question. I'm having this problem. What do I do? And then the Buddha, sometimes he'll give a teaching, and he'll tell it like a sutra. And sometimes he says, this reminds me of a past life. And then he tells a story. Once I was a crocodile, and he tells the whole story. At the end of the story, all the Jatakas have the same formula, is at the end of the story, he comes back to the present and he says, in that lifetime, I was the crocodile. The monkey was Devadatta, for example. The female crocodile was Yaśodharā. Every time there is a wife in the Jatakas, whether it's a crocodile wife or a monkey wife or a human wife, it was her. And this to me was the greatest revelation, because I realized, they were married for a long time. They were married lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. She's not just a character that gets thrown in so he can leave her. She's a character that is beside him for lifetimes. Every time he's married to her. It's not like he has all these women he's been married to, and each lifetime he's married to a different person. She's with him from one Jataka to the next Jataka to the next Jataka. And when I thought about that in a way that I never allowed myself to really think about it before, I sat back and I thought, that's the most romantic thing I've ever heard. And I don't tend to think of Buddhism as a particularly romantic tradition, right? You think of Buddhism and you think austerity, you think leave your wife behind, you think renunciation, monasticism, right? It's very serious. And here is a way of reading the tradition that is deeply beautiful and sensual and romantic and emotional. And I hadn't registered that until I looked at the Jatakas as though I was reading them for the first time. And I thought, we've been missing something about the tradition. He's been with her and he chose her life after life after life. That's very beautiful. So when I started to create the story of Yaśodharā and the Buddha, that was my leading philosophy, was there's something very profound about this relationship, that it's not just, I'm going to leave her, but that leaving her is going to be a tremendous decision. There was another piece in the literature that I found that I also held on to as I wrote the book. And that was that when the Buddha takes his final rebirth, right? So he does all of his lifetimes. And when he's just finished and he's going to be reborn one last time, it's like the Middle East. So when he's just about to take his last rebirth, it says, you know, he comes down in the shape of the white elephant, which you guys might have some feeling with. And so he floats down into his mother's body. It's a very beautiful scene in Buddhist hagiography. But there's this line that comes up in all these texts that I kept finding. It's this one line that I never noticed before, but that keeps getting repeated. And the line is that when he came down for his final rebirth, he came down with 7 other beings, that they came into the final rebirth together. So that when the final birth happens, he doesn't do it alone. It's not just the Buddha floating down on by himself. He floats down at the same time as his chariot driver, who's going to carry him through his departure. He comes down at the same time that the tree is seeded into the earth, the tree that the Mahabodhi tree, that he will achieve awakening under. The seeds plant themselves when he plants himself in his mother's womb. And so you have these very special parts of his biography that are coming with him into his last story. And included in the 7, the only female, is her, so that she takes her final rebirth right next to him. So not only do they go lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, but she's one of the privileged few who will also be born with him. She's not a marginal character. She's at the heart of the story. And we've been deleting her, forgetting about her, not paying attention to her for hundreds of years. So I took those pieces and I went back to the rest of the literature and I thought, okay, I'm going to try to imagine what she went through. And I looked at all the early sources that I could find that tell her story. And so her story is that she comes down with him and they're born together. And then we kind of lose sight of her because it goes very quickly through the childhood, right? These texts don't pay that much attention to it. And so he grows up in his palace. Eventually he turns 16. There's a lot of Buddhist texts. As you guys know, Buddhism is very complicated. And there's so many texts and we never know what we're reading half the time. But we get a whole bunch of texts that tell from all over the Buddhist world that tell us that when he was 16 years old, it was time for him to get married. And the stories about him getting married are fantastic. So many of these stories are Indian, and the Indian storytelling tradition is fantastic. It's fabulous. It's Bollywood, right? I mean, it's just Bollywood from 2,000 years ago. And so what they tell us, and one version of the story, is that the ministers go see the Buddha, or the future Buddha, the prince, and they say, we think you have to get, and they're worried because he's not very interested in being a king. And so they can feel he's philosophical. He's not very attached to the throne. And so they think, okay, let's get him married. Maybe that's going to help. So they go to see him and they say, you need to get married. And so one version is that the prince goes, okay, fine. If you really need me to get married, I'll get married. But then he writes a list of all the attributes she must have if he's to agree to marry her. She has to be the most beautiful. She has to be a certain height, a certain weight, have these color eyes, from this kind of family, of this caste. I mean, the list does not end. She has to be perfectly generous, perfectly virtuous, perfectly beautiful, perfectly perfect. If you can find her, I will get married. So it sounds like he's basically setting up the ministers. He's never going to get married. But they go, and now you have a Cinderella story. And they go from house to house and they knock on the door and they pull out their scroll and they read the list. We're looking for this woman. And in each household, the answer is just, we don't have her. And then one day the ministers knock on another door and Yaśodharā is the one to answer. And they read the list. And this is my favorite part. She listens to the list and she says, well, that's me. Which is fantastic. And they're like, oh, that's right. It is you. And then she says, I'm supposed to marry that man. And if you don't hurry up, I'm going to have to marry somebody that's lesser than that. And that will be a shame for me and a shame for him. So move it along. And they're like, we're coming back. And that's how they got married. So we've got this like audacious character, this character in the literature that has gumption and personality. And she's a strong female character. And this is a 2,000-year-old Indian text. How have we missed that all this time? Another version of the story, also Cinderella, I like. So this is the one I chose in my book, but I was torn between the two. The other one is that they decide to call all the virgins of the land and present themselves to the prince, and he chooses the wife that he wants. And so again, you see, this is fairy tales, but this is a Buddhist fairy tale. And so all the virgins of the land are pulled together from all over the world of the Buddhist kingdom, which is probably not that big, but in their imagination, it's very big. And they all present themselves to the palace. And he's going to meet with each one, and he decides he'll give them a jewel to thank them, almost like a party hat or something, like a loot bag, right? He'll give them a jewel and thank them for coming. And so if he likes one, he'll choose her. And so all the women present themselves. And the last, this is again why I like her so much, the last woman to arrive, because she's late. It's fantastic. She arrives late. She's the last in line. All the other women present themselves. And then she's at the end of the line. And he just looks at each woman, gives them a gift, keeps going, gives them a gift, keeps going. He's not interested. And then Yaśodharā presents herself. And she looks in the basket where all the jewels were, and there's no more jewels. And she looks at the basket and she said, you don't have any more jewels left for me? Again, preserved in an ancient Indian text. I mean, it's just fantastic. And he's like, oh no. And so he pulls off his own necklace and he places it on her neck. And in some versions, she looks at it and she goes, that's it. So we have, again, in all of these texts, this kind of fantastic, strong female character who has a voice that we somehow allowed her to be deleted, which makes no sense. So they get married. And according to the tradition, they're married for many years. Usually this goes on sometimes for 12 years. And she's living in the palace. And the tradition is, of course, that the Buddha doesn't leave the palace, right? And so he is, I think we have somebody at the door again. No, but they left. He's isolated in his palace, right? And so his father, when he was born, got the horoscope, if you all know this part of the story, that the horoscope said that there was a chance that he would leave home and choose the life of a religious teacher. And so to ensure that his son never grows up and becomes a monk, he closes his son in, right? And so the tradition is that he lives, again, it's a fairy tale, but that he lives a very, very isolated life. He never leaves the confine of his palace compound. And so he grows up not seeing any suffering, because suffering is what leads us to a philosophical life, right? So long as we're not suffering, we don't need to worry about anything. But the second we start suffering, we wonder, what am I doing here? What is this about? And so he figures if his son never suffers and never, right? One of the definitions of suffering in the Pali text is very, very simple. It's getting what you don't want. That's it. That's the whole definition in the Pali Suttas, is getting what you don't want and not getting what you do want. That's the whole definition. And so he figures if he raises his son in such a way that he always gets what he wants and never gets what he doesn't want, which kind of sounds like contemporary parenting, now I'm realizing. If we do that for our children, they're never going to have a hard time. Everything will be okay. And then I don't have to worry about my child running away. It's still true. We're still doing this. And so he's a very relatable parent, but of course it doesn't work. And so the future Buddha, the prince, is living in his palace compound. And even though he gets everything he wants, and it says everything from like, he looks at a piece of cloth and it's yours, right? Which is just whatever you want is yours. Whatever food you want, whatever woman you want, anything you want, you get. And he never sends him to school, and he never sends him to war, and he's never pushed to like become uncomfortable in himself. And yet, even with all of that spoiling, even with all of that desire met, our future Buddha is sitting in his palace going, something's not right. And so eventually, when he's about 29 years old, according to the Indian traditions, he finds a way to escape the palace compounds. They never tell you how he pulls this off. Nobody knows, right? But all of a sudden, one day, there's an opening and he can leave. And so he calls his chariot driver and they get on their horses. And so the future Buddha gets on Kantaka. Kantaka is this fabulous white stallion, really powerful, beautiful, big white horse. And the tradition is that he's so powerful that he could leap over 3 kingdoms in one step. And so this beautiful, majestic white horse and his chariot driver on his separate horse, they escape the palace when no one is looking. We don't know how they did it. And they escape. And now they're on the other side of the palace compound. Now the gods get involved, because we also keep forgetting about the gods. We forgot about Yaśodharā. We forget about wonderful characters like Kantaka. One of the other things that we tend to do, especially in Western Buddhism, is secularize the tradition. So we make it all sound very reasonable. And we get rid of all of the celestial wonder. And Buddhism is nothing if not gobsmacked filled with celestial wonder. And so the gods are up in the skies, and they have been waiting for thousands of years for there to be a Buddha. They're waiting impatiently. They can't wait any longer. He's about to become the Buddha, but he's still not the Buddha. And so they're getting frustrated. They're like, what are you doing? And so he's out of the palace compounds, and they say, you know what? Let's move this along a little bit. And so from the heavens, they deliver the first of the 4 sights, so that it's not supposed to be a real person. It's like a hallucination that they deliver to the prince. And so floating down from the heavens, however you want to imagine it, comes the first sight. And the first sight is the first sight of suffering, which is old age. And so he sees this terribly old person, and he's never seen anything like it because everyone around him is Botoxed. I'm just trying to make it relevant. And he's shocked. And what am I looking at? And Channa says, this is old age. This is going to happen to you too. Keep going. Second of the 4 sights. And that one is sickness. And he's never seen sickness like that. Every time someone's sick, they're scooted away. And so he's never actually been close to it, which is probably true for most of us also. And he says, what happened to that body? And again, this is sickness. This happens to everyone. It will happen to you. So this is really overwhelming him. And then he sees the 3rd sight, and the gods are very excited now. They're sending the 3rd one. This is a big moment. And it's a corpse. And I think everyone who's had this experience, the first time you're in the presence of death, you won't forget it. It's a very profound experience. And it's a very profound experience to be with someone who's alive and then who's dead, because they change, and you know they changed. It's different. And so he is in the presence of death, and he knows something very different is there. And he's the future Buddha. And so what it does to him existentially is very profound. And he says, what is that? And Channa says, that is death. So now the gods are very excited. They can see it is happening finally after thousands of years of waiting. And so now they deliver the final strike. And the final strike is the 4th sight. And the 4th sight is he sees a renunciant, a monk, somebody who's walked away. And he says, what is that? And Channa says, well, that's a monk. That's a renunciant. He left home. And the future Buddha says, if I'm going to be old, and if I'm going to be sick, and if I'm going to die, then I'm going to become a monk. That's it. Decision is made. The gods are ecstatic. Everybody's screaming up in the heavens. It's about to happen. He doesn't hear it. And he goes back to the palace knowing a very difficult decision has just been made. When he comes back to the palace, this is the moment. So while he's been gone, what we find out, according to many of our early texts, he's looking at suffering and he's being transformed by it. He comes home only to find out that while he's looking at suffering, she has been having her parallel experience. She was giving birth. And so he's looking at suffering through the body and she's experiencing it. And she's getting close to sickness and death, just as he's staring at it. And so we see that the two of them are still having this kind of equal, powerful experience, but she's in the world and he's trying to transcend it somehow. And so he comes home and he finds out that she has given birth. And birth 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago would have been very dangerous. And so I've always imagined her pain as she's giving birth while he's thinking about pain, which feels a little unfair to me, to be honest. Now, some of the texts will tell us that he doesn't go to see her. He goes to see his father, because that's where the real struggle is. It's between the father and the son. And so in some texts, he goes to see his father and he says, I have to go now. And his father crumbles. You can't. This is his biggest fear. And when we do that as parents, right? Your biggest fear, and then it happens and you're like, oh, you're trying so hard to control and it doesn't work. And he's been afraid all this time that his son would leave. And now his son is standing in front of him saying, I'm going to leave. And so the father is devastated. And the literature describing this conversation is so beautiful and so heart-wrenching. And the father says, but I'm supposed to retire. You're supposed to take the throne. Like, you can't do this to me. And the future Buddha says, you can't make me stay. And one of the most famous lines of the Buddha Charita, which is this Indian text that I have in mind, is he says, I know the house is on fire. Don't ask me to stay in it. You want to stay in it, you can stay in it, but I'm going. It's a very powerful conversation, and there's nothing you can say to that. And then the king says, I'll give you anything if you stay. And so then the prince says, okay, if you can promise me 4 things, I'll stay. And he says, great, what is it? And he's imagining like 60 virgins and, a box full of jewels and whatever it is. And he says, if you can guarantee for me that I will never grow old, I will never get sick, I will never die, and I will never be poor. If you can guarantee those 4 things for me, I'll stay. And the king says, that's so unreasonable. Nobody can promise you that. And he says, then I'm not staying. So that's one way the story goes. Another way the story goes is that he doesn't go to see his father, that the battle is not a battle between a father and his son. The other way the story gets told is that it's a battle with love. And so he goes to see his wife. And Yaśodharā is sleeping, and she's got her newborn son in her arms. And he goes to her room, and he stands at the threshold. And what's really quite beautiful is that the texts that describe this scene, he doesn't cross the threshold. He stays outside the room. And so he's standing at the door, and he looks at his wife and he looks at his new son. And he thinks to himself, if I touch my son, which means he wants to, that's important. He's a man who wants to touch his son. If I touch my son, she will wake up, and then I won't be able to go. And that line for me that was it. He would not have become the Buddha if she woke up, because they loved each other for lifetimes, which is why I think this story is the most romantic story ever told. So he doesn't. He turns around and he walks out the door. And the next morning, Yaśodharā wakes up and she finds out he's gone, and she is furious. And I mean furious. If you read the sources on this, the anger, the betrayal, the emotion, the tears, these texts don't hold back. And what's so amazing about it is that these texts are following the Buddha. He's racing off, right? So he's like, I'm going to do the great departure. This is the moment that the gods were waiting for. So everyone's excited. The whole heavens are celebrating. He's going. And so he charges out the gates and the gods come. And Kantaka is so powerful that if his hooves would have broken the floor and everyone would have woken up because he's so powerful when he runs. And so the gods come and they put their hands under his hooves so that he doesn't make noise so he can escape. And so you have all these beautiful images in temples of all the gods holding up the horse as he runs. And then they get to the gate and the gate is sealed and it takes 100 men to open. And the gods come and throw the doors open. So this is the moment of celebration. And he goes flying out of the palace and charging across the world to get to a place where his father can't touch him. And so you'd think that the poets and the writers and the storytellers are going to follow him because this is what we've been waiting for. But he gets to the forest and the storytellers stop. And they say, hold on a second, we have to go back to the palace. And the storytellers of these ancient texts go back to the palace for her to wake up so they can be there. And then they tell us what it was like when she woke up. So they don't leave her behind. They continue to follow her story. And what really amazes me is this other realization I had, which is so basic, but somehow it took me a long time to figure out, is that the storytellers who tell us about her pain, they're all male writers. These are men writing these texts. We know these were men who were writing these texts. It's very unlikely that women were producing these texts. And here we have these men telling us of her anguish and of her pain, and they speak it with their voices and their hearts, and you think they knew. And that's really quite beautiful. They stop to tell us about her, and she's mad. And she goes, in some texts, she goes to the chariot driver because he comes back. He tried to stay, and the prince said, you have to go. I don't want anyone here. And so poor Channa goes back, really looking like, and the texts say he looks like he's walking in a funeral procession. He's so sad to have left him behind. And Kantaka died at the forest gate because he didn't want to leave his master behind. And so he drops dead right at the edge of the farm. It's very dramatic. And so poor Channa walks back all the way, all by himself. And he enters back into the city and he goes into the stables and she comes running and her eyes are red with rage. And she throws open the doors of the stables and she said, how dare you take my husband away like that? She is furious. She is exploding the stables with her rage. And he says, I tried to stop him. I couldn't. And then she says to him, my favorite part of this story is she says, how could you let him go? Didn't you tell him about me? You should have told him I'm here. He's not allowed to go. That's Yaśodharā. I'm going to stop there and see if you guys have questions. It's a good story, right? Isn't it awful that we haven't been telling this story?
I don't think most of us have ever heard the story of the Buddha in that way. I mean, it was fantastic, wasn't it? I mean, I think you'd agree with me that there's so much romance, there's so much drama. You know, I kept thinking this has got to be a TV show. I mean, you know, this has got to be a movie. I mean, this is going to win the Academy Award. I was even thinking of who would play Yaśodharā and who would play the Buddha. I mean, you know, but Vanessa would write the script because she's got it down. She's got the drama down. She's got the romance down, you know, and it's such a striking story. And she's telling it from the sources, you know. And so, yes, you know, she wrote a novel and it's fiction. And some of people might think, well, fiction, you know, you can't believe it. But that's what the Buddhist texts are. They're as she said, they're storytellers. So these are all stories. But what we know from fiction, and this is why we read fiction, is that, yes, it's a product of the imagination. Yes, it's kind of made up, but fiction tells many truths. And I think you can see in this story the truth of affection between two people, the truth of romance, the truth of family, the truth of suffering, the truth of somebody who's making a sacrifice to go out try to find the solution to that suffering. And it's all put not so much as we usually hear it in terms of Buddhist doctrine or Buddhist teaching, but as a real gripping story, one that is full of romance and full of drama. And Vanessa has done the service to, I think, the Buddhist community of retelling. She's not inventing it, she's retelling the story, but doing it in such a way that we can all hook in right away. And wow, this is really romantic. This is really dramatic. The Buddha was in love. And it goes against our sort of normal ideas, as Vanessa started off saying, that, we have this image of Buddhism as being severe, monastic, you renounce the world, and so on. So the story she's telling actually introduces a really interesting tension in our understanding, I think, because to become the Buddha, he had to leave the palace. To become a monk in Japanese, the word is shukke, to leave your home. You have to leave your home. You have to renounce all attachments, and you enter into this monastic order where there are no women, or not supposed to be, and there's no romance and there's no drama like it is. So if you take it as a whole, the story of renunciation and intense human feeling and human attachment, and you kind of have to wonder which side is going to sort of win out. Is it the really human side where we're feeling all of these feelings of romance and family and so on, sacrifice, and the side where you say, okay, I'm going to renounce it, I'm going to become a monk or a nun. We'll talk about that in the next lecture when we deal with the next book that Vanessa has written. But there's this real tension between the two. And the question that comes up in my mind, and this is what I want to toss out to Vanessa, and then after she responds, we'll open it up to your questions, because I'm sure you have a lot. But the question in my mind is, which side is going to win? Love, romance, family attachment, or detachment?
Hard question. I don't know. I mean, I think obviously the Buddhist answer is, at the end of the day, you have to let go. I think that's the whole point of the tradition, is we have to let go. So detachment wins, but it's so hard. I think that's what it is that the tradition, I think what we've done when we just say, oh, the Buddha was a prince and then he left home and saw the four sights and then, the end, he becomes a Buddha, and right? Like that's kind of how we tell the story. I think when we don't tell about the love and the romance and the emotions and the father-son struggles and the loss of his mother, when we don't tell all the emotional stuff that comes with his family history, it's like we're pretending it wasn't hard. And it's hard for everybody. I've met monastics all over the world. Every time I have the privilege of sitting with them and hearing their story of how they made a choice, it's never easy. It might be clear, this is where I want to go, but the process of going, for all of us, for all the big decisions that we make in our lives, we might be very clear about where we want to go, but what a process to get there. It's hard to be human. We feel things, we're sad, we get attached, we fall in love, we get devastated. I've had the argument so many times about if this was a romantic story or not. And I always think, if you say that the Buddha was not in love with his wife, that he didn't love her, then what kind of a man is he? That he would just leave and not even care? Is that the story that we want to say? So he was with her lifetime after lifetime, but it didn't matter? Then the fact that he became a renunciant was no big deal. That's a crazy story to tell. Obviously, he cared and he became a renunciant. That's the heroic journey, right? That it's because you care that it matters. If he felt nothing for anyone, then he's a robot. then he has no business telling us anything about our experience. And how is that supposed to be inspiring? I can't even relate to it. Right now, obviously, I understand in Mahayana traditions, you have ideas of him being a reflection and a manifestation, and it gets very, very big. But as a story of a human being, and so much of the early literature really tells us stories about a human being who went on a heroic journey. He has to have cared. He has to have loved. He has to have wanted to touch his child. That's what they tell us he wanted to do. And he chose renunciation. That's why it's heroic, not because it was easy. So I think the end of the story has to be renunciation, not even just because that's the Buddhist argument. The end of the road has to be renunciation because we're going to die. So we're going to have to let go one way or another. There's no way out of this. We're going to let go. The question is, what's the journey until then? And I think his journey was a real journey.
Fast forward a bit. So for centuries, the tradition of monks and nuns was renunciation. And so, they wouldn't get married, wouldn't have relations with the opposite sex, and all kinds of very, very strict rules, And then along comes this guy named Shinran. And, he breaks the tradition. And again, it's a good reminder that the way how traditions grow is you break them and then you come up with something new. So Shinran comes up and he says, so he solves the problem. And if we were to pose the same question, which side wins, Shinran, love or renunciation? He'd say, love, get married. And so these guys are married because the choice has been made of human affection over renunciation. And that doesn't take away from the renunciant's job of somehow working towards the solution of suffering, but it's just kind of a very practical realization that, and maybe the Buddha was there too, practical realization that, for all the talk about renunciation, it's really hard. And so maybe in the end, love does win out. But for centuries, the answer was renunciation. But for Mahayana Buddhists in Japan, they made a clear choice. Love and affection and family can win out.
Okay, so I knew that was coming. Yes and no, though. Because now, I think what you said about the tradition is to break the tradition. So Shinran breaks the tradition. We're going to be married and a renunciant. But renunciation is not just a physical ideal. It's an internal experience. To renounce is to let go. So married or not married, it doesn't matter, right? Like if you then say, okay, we're going to be married and be renunciant and now we've solved the problem. No, because the problem is attachment. It's not marriage. You could be a monk and still be super attached. You can be married and not be. So I don't think the physical part is your solution. I think you still have to do the heroic journey. Whether you're in Pure Land Buddhism or anything else, you still have to be the hero of the story and charge through the mental gates and overcome suffering. And marriage or not marriage is not going to solve that for you. So I don't think Shinran wins everything. I think it was great for the moment, but you still have to do the work. Yeah. You never get out of the work.
Okay, let's open it up. We have 15 more minutes. And so let's open it up to both the online audience. You can type in your question by chat, or for the in-person people, there's a mic that's going to go around. So Reverend Neto.
Years after Siddhartha renounced the castle, he became the enlightened one, and he Sangha.
Mm-hmm.
And in his process of spreading the teaching, he went back to his palace.
He did.
And he met his own father, King Suddhodana, son Rahula, and he also meet Yaśodharā?
Oh, there's some
Yaśodharā?
there. Yes, he did. And
Okay.
there's a great story about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
When Shakyamuni went back to the palace and the family members became the disciples.
Yeah.
Now, Shakyamuni still had a sense of detachment.
Yeah.
But his intent to go back to his palace, previous palace, there was some kind of, not attachment, affection, maybe sympathy, karuna.
Hmm.
So Shakyamuni wanted to take care of the families as his Sangha members. Correct me, I heard this story many years ago when I
Yeah,
was
there
in
you go.
Japan. And is this told in Pali text or?
Yes. So you're perfectly right. What he feels when he goes back, we don't know, because now he's the Buddha. Until he becomes the Buddha, we can have him emotional, romantic, confused. All of those things are possible. But once he becomes the Buddha, after he leaves, then his emotional experience is very difficult for us to understand, because now he's entered a different stage. So he does go back to the palace. The tradition says what you get in the stories is that the king wants him to come back. So the king sends ministers to go get him and say, please come back so I can see you. And there's some stories that say that every time a minister goes, he meets with the Buddha. He's so impressed with the Buddha, he doesn't leave. And so he stays. So the king keeps losing his ministers because they never come back. So finally, because, he's the Buddha, he's very incredible. So eventually one of the ministers says, look, I will go, but I think it's going to happen to me too. So if you let me become a monk, I'll promise to bring him back. So the king says yes. And so that minister goes and he says, you need to go see your father. And so the Buddha comes back to the palace and he gives a teaching in the palace where he sees all his family members. Why he goes back to his palace, the question is a really important one. Is there a question of sympathy with his family? I think that's a really interesting question. And I don't know that we have a clear answer to it. Because on the one point, he did go back to see his father and he says, it's my father. He doesn't say this man. So he still has a relationship, right? When his mother, when Mahapajapati, the queen, dies, he says, my mother has died. So he still speaks like these relationships are real. I think that's important because even if he doesn't feel attachment, he still recognizes the relationships. And what I think we've done in the West is we've told ourselves that renunciation means everyone you love doesn't exist anymore. And I don't think that's how it works. When the queen dies, he says, my mother has died. I think he doesn't have the same feeling he had before, but he still knows she's his mother, right? That relationship never goes away. So I think sometimes what we think a Buddha is maybe is a little too radical. Maybe he's still a human being, but that's a good question. It's something to think about.
I think it's important to look at Buddhism itself, that Buddha's Sangha was mostly his family.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, and it makes sense because they're the people who know him, right? So it's also not so shocking. It's not as though he called his family back. It's the people who know him are his family. And so he's never divorced, right? His renunciation doesn't mean that his family has disappeared. And I think sometimes we think that's what it meant. Yeah. Did you have a question? I think she had one.
Sorry, I wanted to try to get this before I forgot what it was I was going to ask. But in any case, when in your reading and in your research, since you were reading quite a bit about Shakyamuni's wife at the time, I was wondering if there was any description about how she was actually also not forced, but renunciation was also chosen for her, but not by her when he left.
Well, what you get is her sorrow that it was chosen for her, right? So one of the things that happens in India when a man chooses a life of renunciation, this still happens to this day, is that if a man is married and he chooses a life of renunciation, she becomes a widow, even though he's still alive. It's a very odd thing. And so I don't know if this is still practiced in India, but certainly for quite some time, you would even get a certificate of death, right? And one of the rituals that happens that they certainly still do is that in Hinduism, when you become a renunciant, there are these secret rituals that get performed where you do your own cremation ceremony, right? So that you would lie down on a ghat, like a cremation area, and sometimes they do it all night long, and you wrap yourself in a shroud, and then it's very secret between the teacher and the disciple. But we do have some descriptions that have been written where people have written about it, so we know. And you imagine your old self burning away so that when you stand up again, it's gone, right? So that's a very radical understanding of separation. She becomes a widow in this context because her husband has left. And in a lot of the literature, she chooses to put on white clothes of a widow. And that's a devastating experience. And so I think just by making her a widow and having her put away her jewels and her beautiful clothes and having to wrap herself in white cotton cloth, there's a profound loss for her. And I think that's what the literature is pointing to, is that, and that's what's so beautiful about it, is that this tradition that is written by men, that's focused on the Buddha, still takes some time to tell us, you know what, she had a really hard time with his decision, you know, and they give that to us. So they don't make it. When I was writing this book, I met with a teacher in Sri Lanka, a very conservative Buddhist teacher, very senior. I can't say who it is because it's not right. But this teacher, when I told this person that I was writing this, they said, okay, but when you write it, you have to say that Yaśodharā was happy. Like waving goodbye as he's like galloping off. And I was like, but that's not the story. What are you talking about? And they were like, that she was very happy to support him in his quest for awakening. And I was like, I'm going to get in trouble. But the tradition doesn't do that. The tradition tells us she suffered. I think that's genius. They give us the complexity.
Are there any questions from the online chat?
In the chat box, it's there's a one question and comments, and then it said, "I've never heard the Buddha's living like this. I always wondered how he could leave his newborn son. Then she becomes a disciple when he returns many years later. How could he have left?"
This is the puzzle of the tradition, right? If the tradition were easy, if the whole story was laid out for us with no questions, why would we still be interested? This story has been going for 2,500 years. The reason it's been going for 2,500 years is because it's a good story. And a good story is usually a hard story. It's a hard story. He's not some perfect, I mean, eventually he becomes perfect, but the story is a bit of a mess. And that's what makes it rich. That's what makes it that we want to retell it and retell it and retell it and scratch our heads going, what do I do with this? It's not handed to us on a silver platter here. It's all done for you. You have to sit with it and figure out what to do with it. When I wrote the book, I was writing the book to figure out how I can live with the story. It was me struggling with the story. I think you're supposed to struggle with it.
We have a break coming up at 7 o'clock, but there was a question. There was a question from on the registrations, and I thought this might be interesting. Says, does Yaśodharā remind you of any famous women today or recent past?
Huh. I think it reminds me of every single person in the world. It's true. I think this is a human story. I think this is everybody's story. Anyone who's going to be heroic and challenge their lives and try to do something real with their time, that's what this story is. And it's a story of suffering, and it's a story of overcoming suffering and of wrestling with suffering. It's the human story.
Great. I want to remind you that through the grace of Mrs. Umitani, we have copies of Vanessa's book, both Yaśodharā and the Buddha, as well as the second book, Gathering, available for you to purchase, and then probably get an autograph. And also there are a number of free books on the table brought over from headquarters that are also available. Maybe you can look at them during the break. So we have some cookies and there's some water outside, and we'll reconvene at about 7:10. Okay, our second lecture this evening is going to be about the second book, The Gathering.
We're back for round 2. Are you guys okay for 2 hours of this? I find you guys very powerful. Most of my students would be asleep now. Okay, so this is the next story. And if you thought the Buddha looked bad a little bit in the last one, he's going to look worse now. So first he leaves his wife and his child. Then he becomes the Buddha. So that's good. And then he's in the forest and he's awakened and he's doing very well. And monks, men, the family members, I forget who asked that, but the family members are joining him. And so the boys, the men of his family hear, oh, he's become the Buddha. I'm going to go join him in the forest. And so one man after another walk into the forest. And also that includes the ministers who keep going and joining him. And they say to him, I'd like to shave my head and become a monk. And the Buddha's answer is one word: come. That's it. That was the whole ordination ritual. Just, sure, sit down. And they would be monks and they would practice together. And it was the most uncomplicated, unceremonious. There's no levels of ordination. There's no trials. There's nothing. Very different from today. Just come. Now comes the tricky part. If you know the Buddha's life story, the early part, I'm going to go backwards in time for a second because I need to build up. So the Buddha is born, his mother is Maya, right? And so we all know about Maya. She's this blissful, perfect mother figure. And she's a perfect, blissful mother figure because she dies immediately, right? So we get rid of her immediately so she never gets messy. So she dies right after she gives birth to him. And so when she dies, the woman who's going to take over is her sister, right? I think most of you know this. And her sister has a complicated name. It's Mahaprajapati, right? Or Mahaprajapati Gautami. So I'll just call her Gautami. It's easier. But Mahaprajapati Gautami is Maya's sister, and she's going to take over raising the Buddha. And so she is there through all the tough parts. She raises him. She makes sure that he's breastfed. She makes sure that he's safe. She's there watching this dynamic between father and son and all the tension that is building and all these weird parenting decisions that are happening. She's there every step of the way. And she's there taking care of her husband, taking care of the palace. She's the queen. She does everything. It should sound familiar. And then the king dies. She has now fulfilled all of her responsibilities. And so she's living in the palace as a widow with her daughter-in-law, Yaśodharā, who's also a widow. And so we have these two women who have no status, who have nothing left to do. Their husbands are gone in one way or another, and they're just in the palace. Yaśodharā's son is also gone, right? And so there's another scene, and that's the scene when he comes back to the palace. Everybody goes to see the Buddha. The one person who does not go see the Buddha, do you know who that is? When you've heard this story, do you know who's the one person who doesn't go to see him? Yaśodharā. She refuses. So she sees him through the window looking into the courtyard, and she thinks, if he wants to see me, he's going to have to come find me. And she walks away. And so everyone is going to kiss his feet and go, oh, the Buddha has arrived. The Buddha has arrived. She's the only one who does not go. And she stays in her room, and the Buddha goes to find her. And he enters her room almost like a husband. And the moment she sees him, she cries. And then after she cries, he announces to her, I'm taking our son with me. So it's not over. The story's really not over. And so we have this very famous scene of Rahula, the son, who goes to see his father, and he says, I want to know about my inheritance, which is a very odd thing for him to say. And the Buddha's response is, your inheritance is to become a monk. That's the only inheritance that's left. He doesn't have a palace to give him. He doesn't have anything to give him. And so the only thing that he can give him is the teachings. And so little Rahula's, who's maybe 7 or 8 years old, is now leaving with his father to enter the forest without his mom. So now Yaśodharā has lost her son, her husband, her status, her clothes, and she's living in a palace with her mother-in-law and no one else. So you can imagine the desolation of this space. Everyone's gone. And the men, the ones who are still alive, keep disappearing into the forest, right? And so you have a real sense of like, it's renunciation is being done to her. She's not choosing it. And that's what's so dramatic about her life story, is that it is being performed on her life. And she just has to stand there and take it. And so once this palace has emptied in this way, Mahapajapati Gautami, we don't know where this has come from, but all of a sudden she rises out of the story. And we didn't really see her before. She's this kind of quiet character who's just fulfilling all of her social responsibilities. And it's like she's invisible in the literature, right? Yaśodharā has become invisible to us, but we weren't paying attention. She was there. But Mahapajapati, we don't get stories about her. The tradition doesn't tell us what she was doing or what she was like. She's this invisible female character who all of a sudden stands up, which I feel like that happens in families sometimes, where there's an invisible family member and all of a sudden everybody turns their head going, where did they come from? And I think that's what's happening with her. And so all of a sudden she stands up and she announces, I'm going to the forest. And this has not been done before. And so again, we have these women characters who are so much more courageous and so much more powerful than anything we've allowed ourselves to imagine, because we just think all women of the past are mute and have no personality. And this woman has personality. And so she's decided, I'm going to the forest. And according to the literature, now here we get different stories, but most of the tradition will tell us that 500 women all of a sudden show up coming out of their houses going, I'm coming. Right. And so we get this movement, but we don't understand how it happens. It's just like the threads of gossip have like moved between the homes. And all of a sudden women come pouring out of their houses going, let's go. And these women walk out. And it's wild. Now, there's one text. So I used all kinds of texts, just like constructing the other book. I had to read and read and read to figure out how to continue the story. And the book, I was actually upset with myself that I didn't pack it in my bag. It's a book that I really think everyone should have. It's called the Therigatha. And I can write it down for you if you want to know it. There's a translation by Charles Hallisey that's really very beautifully done. It's the best translation that I think is out there. The Therigatha is a collection of 73 poems that are about 2,000 years old. It is the oldest collection of women's voices on earth. I don't think we have ever found an equivalent to it anywhere else in the world. So to give you an example, the Hebrew Bible dates to about 1000 BC, so about 3,000 years old, all the way to about 0 is the dating of the writing of the Old Testament. In that collection, we have one set of verses that we think may have been from a woman. That's like 2 lines. That's it. In the New Testament, we have nothing. In the Quran, we have nothing. In the Therigatha, we have 73 complete poems that we believe were written by women. There's no equivalent on earth. This is Buddhist poetry. It is worth owning. It is worth reading. It's worth returning to. There's no equivalent to it on earth. And in these poems, what they are is poems that we think were written by individual women, because they're all different, that tell the story of how they were living in suffering, and then they found the Buddha and they became free. And every single poem ends with the same recipe, and then I became free, or some version of that. Like there's a different way of saying it in each poem, but they all end with, I did it. Not one woman says, I think I made progress. Or I'll check with a man and we'll see if he can tell me if I got closer to awakening. I'm not sure. I don't want to bother anyone, but maybe I did a little bit. Nothing like that. Or I'm so sorry, but I think I might have achieved awakening. Nothing like that happens. No one apologizes. The women just say, it is done. That alone is fantastic. Each story, each poem, when they tell you their stories, some of them are, I was a queen, but I didn't feel like being a queen anymore, so I left and now I'm. But most of the stories are, you know, I had one story is I put the noose around my neck and then I heard the Buddha's teaching and I took it off and then I became free, right? Or I was a homeless widow by the side of the road and I saw the women passing and I went with them and I became free, right? Like it's story after story of individual women's lives, of real lives. I was a courtesan, I was a prostitute, I was, you name it, they were it. And so when they tell you that 500 women poured out of their homes, it's 500 all kinds of women, from prostitutes and courtesans to homeless widows to women who are on the verge of suicide and queens and princesses. And they all pour out of their homes and they say, we're going. And I think that's fantastic, right? And you have to remember, this is India. It's a very hierarchical society. Prostitutes don't walk with queens. They don't share meals with queens. They don't stay in the same tent with queens. Everybody has their category, right? And then you have women from different kingdoms that were at war with each other in the literature. And all these women from all these different backgrounds, all these different stages in life, come together and walk together to ask the Buddha if they could come and sit with him in the forest. It is, I think, one of the most empowering, beautiful, impressive stories, and it's 2,500 years old. Right? One of the things that I was telling Georges that has really struck me since I wrote this book is that I think in my imagination, the feminist movement started in the 1960s when women started burning their bras, right? That's it. I mean, there was Mary Wollstonecraft and a bunch of others before, but basically, right, this was like a 1960s North American experience. This was not. Women have asked before. Women have challenged the system before. We were not the first to do it. And so there's something very narrow in our vision that we think we're the first to figure everything out. Women 2,500 years ago saw the ceiling and said, I want to break it. So these women pour out of their houses all of a sudden, and Yaśodharā pours out of the palace. And they all stand behind Mahapajapati Gautami, and all of a sudden we see the queen in all of her regal splendor in a way that we've never seen her before. And they say, let's go. And they walk towards the Buddha. The story's going to get ugly. I'm just warning you now. I'm seeing all the women's faces in the room going, oh. So brace yourselves. They go into the forest and they go see the Buddha and they say, it would be well if we could join the order and become nuns. And the Buddha looks at the women and says, don't ask the question. So again, Gotami says, it would be a good thing if we could join the order and become nuns. And again, the Buddha says, I don't think you should ask this question. It's not a yes, it's not a no, it's the most evasive, unhelpful thing in the world. Third time. Now in India, there's a tradition. If somebody offers you rice and you say no, they're going to offer you a second time. You say no a second time. If they offer you a third and you say no, that's it. It's a definite no. 3 is like the end of the story. So the third time, Gotami, the queen, the stepmother, the aunt, the one who raised him, says it would be a good thing if we could shave our heads and become nuns. And he says, don't ask me this question. It's 3 times. Now, the rule with renunciation is you leave home, you don't go back. Now, today we have all kinds of monks who go back. We've always had monks who go back and nuns who go back, but traditions, now it happens a lot more. But the tradition is you have to be sure about what you're doing because this is a serious decision. And once you go, you don't come back. So the second the road gets difficult, you don't say, okay, I didn't like it. The road's difficult and you have to keep going. So now they're stuck. He knows this. They've left home. They can't go back. So now they're nowhere. So he's left them in a very difficult position. And he leaves and he walks with his monks, who all he had to say was come, right? That was the whole ritual. He leaves with his monks and they go off to the next village. And the women are just standing there. They can't go home. They can't go with him. They are homeless in a very profound sense of the term. Something else happens. They're going to follow him. They're going to go for the 4th time, which is really quite radical. So just that, the fact that they don't just go, well, I guess we'll go sit somewhere in a corner. They decide they're going to ask him again. So they go for the 4th. So that already is radical. But when they get to him, and I'll go backwards in a second, but when they get to him, there's a detail in the literature that was my favorite detail for this book, is that when they arrive, the monks see the women, and the monks say, oh, but monks describe the women as having tears on their faces, having dust on their robes. So now they're wearing robes. Didn't say that before. And with their heads shaved. It didn't say that before. And so the question that a lot of scholars have been wondering about is, when did they shave their heads? Because they didn't have permission yet, right? He has to say, come, and then you shave your head. But they went and he said, go away. And now they have their heads shaved. And so that has been a really interesting question for scholars for a long time, is what's with the bald heads? Did they have permission to do that? Did they defy the Buddha? Did they shave their heads even though they did not get permission? It's a really interesting question. The way I tell the story, I won't tell you what I did with that, but the women are going to walk through the forest. And as they walk, more and more women kind of add themselves to this collection, right? So that you've got these like women streaming out of the houses. And what is so moving is that the Terigata, that text of poetry, tells us that not all the women who join what I call the gathering, the women who are walking, they don't all go because they have some spiritual ideal they're trying to fulfill. They go sometimes because they're hungry. So this homeless widow on the side of the road, she's standing on the side of the road, she sees the women passing, and she says, if I go with you, will you feed me? And the women says, yes, we'll feed you. You can come with us. That's in the Terigata. That to me is one of the most important poems in the Terigata, because it tells us something that's still true in the monasteries today, is that our monasteries all over the world are filled with people who are there because they have nowhere else to go. Children are left at doorsteps of monasteries all over the Buddhist world, right? The monastery is not always a place filled with the greatest spiritual adepts who are going there for some really profound reason. They're going because they need food. right? I was in India a couple of years ago, and there was this Thai monastery in India, in Vaishali, and all the boys that were monks in this monastery were all low-caste Hindu boys whose families were too poor to feed them. And so they shaved their heads and put on the robes to live there during the day, but they would go home for lunch to see their moms, and then they would come back and they would eat one meal a day with their families, but they couldn't live there the rest of the time. And they told me this very openly. We're here because we don't have any food otherwise. So once a day they would eat with their families and they go back to the monastery. This was a completely understood phenomenon. The monastery was taking care of them. You see that in the Therigatha, right? She just says, if I go with you, will you feed me? And they say yes. There's another woman, a princess, who goes because everyone else in the palace left and she was bored. All her friends were there. And so she went also, which also happens, right? Your best friend becomes a nun. And so you're like, okay, and you go also. I've seen this happen many times where people join religious communities because their friends are there, right? So it's a very human collection of people. It's, again, not the stories, everybody's a saint and everybody's perfect. It's ordinary people with ordinary desires who are just trying to make life work. But in the process, they become free, which is the ideal. So all these women are walking, and they eventually get to the next town, and they do something fantastic. This is the oldest woman's trick in the book, is they're not supposed to be there. The men have already rejected them. So they just stand there quietly with tears in their eyes, and they wait until the men feel bad enough to come get them. So eventually the monks come and they say, what are you doing here? And that's when we find out that they have shaved heads. And they say, we've come to ask for ordination. And the response is, but you can't. He already said no 3 times. And the women just, which works. So Ananda, the one who's the go-to character, he goes to tell the Buddha, we have a problem. The women are here. And so the Buddha says, fine. Women can be ordained. Finally. But, and this is the hardest part of the story, women can be ordained, but they have to agree to follow extra rules. These are known as the Garu Dharmas. And the Garu Dharmas are known as the heavy rules, the weighty rules. They're very important. And they begin with, if a woman has been ordained 100 years, and a man has been ordained 1 day, she bows to him. That's rule number 1. There's rule after rule after rule outlining the relationship between the monks and the nuns, where the nuns will always be inferior. So, for example, monks teach nuns, but nuns never teach monks. Nuns give confession to monks, but monks never confess to nuns. It's one thing after another to ensure the monks are here, the nuns are there. And so the Buddha says, if you want to become ordained, you have to accept this. And so Gautami says, fine. And she takes ordination. But then, if you keep, everybody stops reading at that point, because everybody's like, oh, close the book, right? So if you're reading the Vinaya, that's what happens. That's the text of ancient monastic rules. Everybody stops. But if you keep reading, you're going to see something really quite amazing. That again, the Vinaya is produced probably by men, but they record the next part. And the next part is that Gautami says, yeah, okay, fine, sure, right? Also, oldest woman's trick in the book. Sure, I'll take the rules. But then, as soon as she's ordained and she got what she needed, the first thing she does is argue about it. And she says, Lord, which is how it gets translated in the early Vinaya, like Bhante, Buddha, can we renegotiate the first rule? I would like an amendment on rule number 1, which to me, again, tells me something we kept missing. She understood this patriarchy. She understood the unfair. It's not as though she was like, oh, this is a great set of rules. Fantastic, I'm in. She took it because that was her only chance. But then she argues about it. she knows, she's not stupid. She understands what just happened. And so the first thing she does is says, let's change that first rule. And the Buddha's answer to that request is really revealing, because his answer in the Vinaya is the monastic, the old 7 volumes of monastic rules. His answer to her request is not, I'm right, you're wrong, don't ask questions. He says, it would not be seemly if other communities see monks bowing to nuns. We cannot do that. They cannot afford the social difficulty of breaking with convention like that. He knows he needs to survive in his world. He knows he needs donations like every religious community in the world. If we let monks bow to nuns, no one will support us. So no. That's the next book. I'm not going to tell you how I solve it. I'm just giving you the story. But I will say that the reason I told this story, I tell stories that bug me because I need to work it out. So this is my own kind of way of processing. There's stories that are also important to me. I've spent a lot of time with monastic organizations over the years. And I've spent a lot of time with nuns from all over the Buddhist world. And they're still negotiating these rules. These rules are not gone. And so this story, just as Yaśodhara's story is present in a kind of very personal, universal way that it matters to all of us because it's the human story, this is also the human story. This is, we're trying to do something great and then the world comes crashing in on us. It's also the human story and the real lived story of Buddhist women all over the world. It is the story that every Buddhist monastic community has to respond to. You can't get away from this story. So every community in the world has to negotiate it. They can negotiate by saying, we'll ignore it. Some communities have done that. And they say, forget the 8 rules. Other communities keep it. Other communities interpret it in different ways. But those rules are part of Buddhist history. And so I needed to wrestle out this story because I know it matters. And it's also the oldest story in the world. It's the story of people trying to do something great and having the world stop you. And I think that's what happened to these nuns. And yet, monastic women are still thriving. Monastic women are still trying to accomplish the greatest objective, the most heroic journey in conditions that are often really quite difficult. So I think it's a story worth telling.
Yeah, okay. Great story again. Thank you. The book is about 20 chapters, and about the first 18 or so chapters are all about this women's march. They're all going towards the Buddha. They want to ask him for ordination, and all kinds of women join. And the stories they tell, you know, I'm whatever it is that they're motivated by to go and seek another kind of life. But mostly it's because they're having a hard life, you know, overbearing husband, too poor, not enough to eat. You know, there are all kinds of issues that they're trying to get away from, and they do so by joining this gathering. And it's really an uplifting story. The first 18 chapters, because it's the women walking and all these other women are joining. And, you know, like Vanessa was saying, the one woman is hungry, you have food, yeah, come, we'll feed you. And so they find liberation in the gathering on a journey to the Buddha, who eventually, you know, says, yes, but you got all these rules and basically you're inferior. So as one of the women says, as Vanessa has it in the book, said, what's the difference? We're running away from inequality and we're just going to get more inequality here. You know, the men put us down over here. Now they're going to put us down over here. The only difference is they're monks and these were householders. But, you know, what's the gain? And it seems to me that the gain was already had in the gathering as opposed to the order. You know, because on this journey, they're getting support. They're feeling liberated. They're feeling equal. And then they finally make it, and now they can join the order, and they're told, but, you know, you're down here, and the monks are up here, and it's still that way. So my question, and we've been going over this question for actually many, many times now.
He hasn't stopped asking this question.
But my question is, why do they want to join the order when they've already gotten some liberation just by being amongst themselves and helping each other out? And now they go to this, you know, male, superior, dominant, put down order, and like there's no gain, you know. And so does the Buddhist order, does the Buddhist Sangha have a solution to the problem of male dominance over women? Or is it just the same thing? And if it's just the same thing, then why bother with the Buddhist Sangha? So it raises a really interesting question about whether or not Buddhism has an answer to the question, how can women be liberated if within the order they're still going to be put down? So why do they join the order?
He really has been traumatizing me with this question for the last 3 days. It's a really sad, it's sad and it's hard. And he's going to say I'm bleak now is what he's going to say next. But my first answer to him was I got super defensive. And I said, well, why does anybody accept going down? Like, I mean, women have been put down in every context under sun, and marginalized communities have been oppressed, and racism. And like, why do we accept any of these injustices? We're just human, and we just do. And I don't know what else to say about that, but I don't think that's an answer. I think I have somebody ask my main character that question at the end of the book. Why did we do this? Why did we accept? And my answer there was, we would have, if we didn't accept this community and just stayed amongst ourselves, we would have created our own inequalities. Because this is what humans do. So just because it's women who are receiving it from men, it's an old story. And so it's easy to get very riled up about it. And I get riled up about it, but it's just human behavior. We always do this. It's what humans do. We treat each other terribly. And the second we get a chance to oppress someone else, we do it. We think we're so enlightened, and the 21st century is like the worst century ever. And this is like with 21 centuries of recorded history behind us, showing us all the terrible things that humans have done, and we should be better. We were supposed to have never again about 50 different events, and we've repeated half of them already. So that's my bleak part. But I do think, I think this is human behavior. And I think if the women made their own community, they would have started oppressing themselves. I don't think that's it's just like what we talked about before. You still have to do the work. There's no organization that's going to fix it for you. Every institution is a mess, not because that institution is wrong. It's a mess because it's human. There's no I'm in the world of education. There's no university or college that has it together. There's no religious organization that has it together. No one has it right. There's no government that has it together. We just don't do things well. The only time we do it is when we do our own work. And so the women of the gathering, whether they're with the men or they're not with the men, whether on the short end of the stick or the bigger, the oppressive end of the stick, it doesn't matter. At one point, you have to transcend samsara. You have to get past this. So if the women are being oppressed, there's a piece of me that thinks at one point, just close your eyes and do the work. And if you're the oppressor, sometimes I think it's harder to do the work, but if you're the oppressor, at one point, close your eyes and do the work. Like you have to get past samsara. Doesn't matter where you are in samsara, you're in it. That's the only answer I have. I think that's why women still do it. I think that's why inequalities still get accepted. I'm a bit at a loss of human madness, but I don't know. I don't think we're any better now than we were 2,500 years ago.
On that happy note.
See, and now he's calling me bleak. I just,
On that
thinks I'm a
happy
very
note, does
depressing
anybody have
person.
questions, Alan?
oh, I don't know what to think. Just wait for the next book. It's even worse.
Well, this is a continuing dilemma, right? Because in our tradition, we struggle with the 35th vow, right? Where you have to be a man to become a Buddha. Women cannot become Buddhas.
Yep.
And so, to some extent, we've just ignored it. It doesn't matter. The 35th vow doesn't matter, right? And then some scholars have tried to give us the idea that it was put together in terms of a social context for which men were dominant and all of that sort of stuff, just as you were saying. But I think we just continue to ignore the dilemma. As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't. The 35th vow doesn't matter. So now we only have 47 that I would contend to, and there must be even others in the 47 that need to be repealed or renegotiated. Right? So, but I certainly appreciate your scholarship in dealing with this issue, because it's an ancient one, right? But yet it's contemporary as well.
It's very contemporary. Woman can't be a president either, apparently.
The question from Terry, she said, do you know how they receive food? Were there people who joined the gathering to serve the followers? And the second question is, were the women hearing some tidbits of the Buddha's teachings that compelled them to keep trying to become of his disciples?
Those are really good questions. To my knowledge, we don't know, because we have the Terigata, and that tells us the stories of these individual women saying, I live this life and now I'm free. But it doesn't tell us anything about how they got there, right? And then in the Vinaya, what you get is just they arrived and they asked, and that's the answer that they got. So we're missing a lot of information. So the monks did record some stuff about women, but we're missing a lot. So I had to imagine, right? I imagined, and that's a little bit what I have to explain in the notes, is I'm working with the Terigata. I see that we have women who did this. I take the women from the Terigata and I have them walking through the forest. But I had to imagine them walking, because I don't have that anywhere. So we don't have, I got an email from somebody in China or Hong Kong who said, where can I find all the stories about how exactly this question, because she was writing a play. I was like, we don't have these stories. So what we have is the end result. And then I had to put the pieces together and try to figure out what would it look like to go from A to B, right? One of the questions I had was, if they're going to go all the way to Vesali or Vaishali, which is the town they go to at the end, where do they sleep? Like when they get to that town. So I needed to figure out somebody who's going to receive them. So I found somebody wealthy who lived in that town in the sources, but then I put those pieces together because the texts don't tell us, how did they eat? Where did they sleep? Who took care of all these women? The other question that I had was, how did they get away with it? Like, how did the men not come with spears and say, you're not allowed to leave? Like how did this work out? And the only answer I have to that question was that it's because the queen was there. That I think she was a much more important figure symbolically than I think we've registered until now. Because if a bunch of homeless women or prostitutes or whatever were walking through the forest, anything could have happened to them. But you had the queen. And I'm sure that played a part. But again, I'm putting pieces together, right? I don't know if that's actually the case. The tradition doesn't tell us. One thing that, so I was telling George about this. I launched the book this summer in Korea. I wanted to launch it at a very specific meeting. There's a meeting that happens every few years where monastic women from all over the world come together. And they come together to network, to talk about these extra rules, to support each other. It's a really important organization that exists. And so I wanted the first time I spoke publicly about this book to be at that meeting, because it needed to be for the nuns first, that they needed to hear the book. And if they didn't like it, I needed to know right away. I was like, I'm just going with them first, and then I can go public. And so I got the invitation to present, and I got to Korea, and I stood on a stage with a stadium of 2,500 bald women. It was extraordinary. Women from all over the world, monastic women who were in the audience as I launched the book. So that was a moment of a lifetime. But the way we set it up was we did a panel conversation first. And on the panel was 3 women from Bhutan. Because in Bhutan, in the Himalayas, in like Tibet, Nepal, India, like all the Himalayan traditions, women have never had ordination. They've never actually brought ordination to Himalayan traditions. So it's not they have it, but they get the extra rules. They never even received ordination. So there are no formal nuns in any Himalayan tradition ever. All the nuns you see in the red robes are partial nuns, but they don't have full status because they're not allowed to take the vows. So they're not treated well. They're at the bottom of the barrel. They don't have any status. They don't have ritual power. They're very, very limited experience. It has been years that Himalayan women have been begging their teachers, please let us have ordination. Now it's complicated what the rules are and why, and that's a whole legal question, which would take me a long time to explain. But basically, at the end of the day, the answer has been no. The Dalai Lama has been petitioned 100 times. They had a special meeting with the Dalai Lama, with scholars from all over the world, lawyers, to try, this is how we can legally make a case to make this allowed. And the Dalai Lama did not say yes. He wavered just like the Buddha of like, and didn't handle it. So women all over the Himalayas have no access to ordination to this day. Until last year, when in Bhutan, the king of Bhutan, and that's a Himalayan kingdom, said, it's enough, we're doing it. And he went against the Dalai Lama. He went against all the other Himalayan traditions. The chief abbot and the king together pushed the doors open and said, you can come. And they ordained 153 women for the first time in Himalayan history. And 3 of those women were on the stage with me. And so they started the conversation and they presented it and they told the audience what it was like to break that barrier. It was extraordinary to listen to them talk. One of the women who was at the head of it said she had gotten so much hate mail and she did not open one letter because she knew if she opened it, she wouldn't have the courage to continue. So she just, every email, she just was the smartest thing she could have done. I don't know how she had the courage to do that, but just email after email, just separate archive folder, just left it there. I don't even know if she opened it afterwards, but she didn't open it until it was finished for sure. And then on the day of the ordination, I mean, it was a 3-day affair and they were all in tents in the forest and they described it as like this magical experience and the whole community had come and 153 women took the vows and shaved their heads for the first time in history. And then a rainbow came out because Tibetans always, like every Himalayan tradition, always a rainbow pops out at the last minute. So the rainbow popped out and she said, this was such a smart line. She said, it looked like a miracle. But then she stopped and she put up her finger and she said, that was no miracle. And I thought, it's always like that. It may look like a miracle, but every time there's a transformation, a change in a system, it's no miracle. Those women fought and fought to get to that point in history. But it happened because the king and the abbot opened the doors. You still need the stakeholders to participate. If they don't and they keep the doors closed, all your grassroots is not going to go anywhere. And so I do think the Queen's presence was really important, because I think in the current story, the King's presence is the reason it happened. The women kept saying, we want it, but they're still being ignored everywhere else. So you can ignore women a long time. But the King of Bhutan did not. I know, I'm a little bleak.
Thank you. I'm Tibetan. So in our culture, in the temples, some areas, women not allowed to go.
Mhm.
So I think, I don't know why.
Not just in Tibet. You have that in Buddhist cultures all over
Japanese
the
too, do you have
world.
like that?
Thailand, you have it everywhere, Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I think it's in on the other hand, we Buddhists, we say even like ants have like Buddha nature, but how we cannot respect men and women equally. How come?
Because we're human and messy.
So we need to clean it up.
I killed the mood. I think it's over.
Yeah. Again, from the registration, here's a relevant question, I think. Can you summarize how Buddhist women in general, those who practice Buddhism without necessarily wanting ordination, can deal with gender-based cultural biases and hurdles?
I'm just going to go back to my mess. Gender is going to hurt. All kinds of things are going to hurt us. I don't know that we're going to get hurt out there. I don't know. I just keep doing the work. I don't know that there's any other answer. Keep trying to be loving, keep trying to undo your own fears and hurts, keep moving forward, because it's going to be out there. If it's not going to be gender, it's going to be something else, but we're always going to upset somebody. We're always going to be excluded from some group. We're always going to be stepped on by someone. This is just samsara. I don't know what else there is to do. I'm too bleak for George.
I mean, I have no idea myself, but taking a clue from your story that the king, well, that's not a story, that's the real life situation, and the queen were the ones who made the progress possible. And if we sort of transport that to our time, maybe it's the law that needs to be changed or instituted so that, it becomes a matter of legal responsibility. And we have all kinds of laws about equality and so on. And that's where our equality or progress in equality has come. It's not from religious groups, but from the law, at least.
But it's precarious because
it is. It is precarious, but who would you count on? The monks or the lawyers? Because
that's not
because who are you going to count on? In your story? Who are you going to count on? The the monks or the queen? And the queen is the one who makes it sort of
But
possible.
that's this queen.
Yeah.
The next queen might not do that.
True. So you got to keep, working at, but my point is that it's the sort of the secular authorities, the queen is not the head nun. She's just kind of a secular authority, and that the secular authority is where we might look for some kind of solution to the problem, because you look to the religious authorities and they're not coming through.
But you're looking for some kind of absolute solution. I don't think you can.
It's not absolute. It's going to change all the time. I mean, yeah.
It's never going to be solved. We're always going to have to fix it again.
That's right.
We just have to keep fixing it.
Yeah, but the point is you keep trying to fix it in the legal system rather than to keep trying to fix it in the Sangha.
Yeah, and then you get a corrupt court. I
Wow. Okay,
but for real,
I give up. It's solved. We are, you are so bleak.
then he says I'm bleak. But it's true. But I think it's why leadership is important. I think if okay, this is the one thing I would say is that if we can put an effort to having serious leadership, I think your leadership changes everything. And when your leadership is corrupt or your leadership is abusive, everything, you have no chance. I think leaders matter. And I think it's really important to value leadership and to value education that will create good leaders. And we need to hold them up and we need to support them, not tear them apart.
Yeah.
Because I think when you have good leadership, things really can happen. Otherwise, we're just pushing a wall that's just going to stay there.
So you're saying vote for Biden?
I'm not American. I'm
Oh yeah, she's
I-
Canadian. She doesn't care what happens to our country.
The whole planet cares. Everybody cares. But I just think leadership matters. I think it makes a big difference. Just like teachers matter and parents matter, but we can't fix it all in one shot. So you just have to fix what you can fix and keep going forward. That's the part that's not bleak. I think you should keep going forward.
I agree.
We have another question from Terry. Her question is, it's hard to hear that the Dalai Lama denied the nuns' request for ordination. Do you know what's the problem? Deep-rooted cultural rules?
I mean, you'd have to ask him ultimately why he hasn't done it. But I think from an outsider perspective, he's in his own precarious situation. He's not home. He lives in someone else's country. He has no political power. His community is increasingly democratic, which means this love and awe of the throne of the Dalai Lama that would have given him power to just sweepingly make decisions, he's losing year by year. He has, just like the Buddha, has to figure out how to survive his political reality. And I think his political reality is not very strong. And so if he wants to survive, he can't upset this group or upset that group. And so he's always being very diplomatic about the decisions he makes. But this has been very frustrating. Right? But then there is a counter question that he doesn't represent all Tibetans. Despite what outsiders think, he is actually the abbot of just one school of Tibetan Buddhism. And so if he makes a sweeping declaration as the Dalai Lama and says, we will accept ordination for all Tibetan community, he has no right to do that. So he also has a limited power, but it would still be very symbolic if he did it, because even though he's only the abbot of one school, he's also kind of the king. And so for the people asking for ordination, it would help tremendously if he said yes, but from his perspective, he has no right to. And so he's in a dance, and he chose not to do anything.
Yeah, perhaps what to do might go back to our conversation about the Jataka tale about the parrot.
Yeah.
You know, you just keep on trying, right? Yeah. Here's another question from the registration. I'm curious if you've done any research on Shinran's wife, Ashini. If not specifically Ashini, perhaps you could generalize what life must have been for her as well.
Well, I think so. I've had the great pleasure of reading Ruth Tabra's books because Dex sent them to me. And I loved those books. And I was so glad to discover them because I was like, oh, kindred spirit, storyteller who's trying to imagine what it would have been like. So I found it a really helpful way to try to imagine these characters that were otherwise very abstract for me, because Japanese Buddhism is not my field. And so I know pieces of Japanese history, but it never became close to me the way this literature has become, like in my bones. And so it was very helpful to hear somebody else who let it become part of her bones, because I could live through her and hear Ruth Tabra's imagination of her. I don't know what life would have been like in medieval Japan. I'm certainly not qualified to be able to weigh in on that, but I do think I had an experience when I was speaking in India a couple of years ago on Yaśodharā. I was speaking to this audience of very well-to-do professionals and intellectuals. And one person got up and he said, I don't think you have a right of making Yaśodharā such a willful character. Women in ancient India wouldn't have been so willful. And I thought, that's a very, it was almost like a colonial idea that had been absorbed. Like all women of the past were Victorian silent women in corsets or something. I don't know, who were like suffocated and couldn't talk because their corset was too tight. I don't think I think history is much more textured and varied. And I think there's enough evidence that I know of for sure as a scholar of early Indian literature that proves to me that women had voices in the ancient world. And I suspect the more we dig, the more we will be thrilled to discover that things were not just, monotonous until the 20th century. And so I would be quite encouraged that somebody like Ashini would have had quite a voice and a presence too, if we just learn how to listen to the literature. And maybe she didn't, but maybe another woman would have. I just don't think we can just say every woman of an ancient era was silent. One of the things that taught me this the most was watching my grandmother, who's a Lebanese, Egyptian, Syrian woman who comes from she's still alive, she's 98, very patriarchal family. And yet I have watched my grandmother all my life wile her way and figure out exactly how to use her voice and when to use her voice and how to get what she needs. There's nothing meek about her. Even though she was married at 18 years old. She dated my grandfather for like 2 minutes, right? Like, it's a whole other context. And yet she has personality, and anyone who meets her knows that this is true. So I really would like us to have a more textured understanding of human history and allow ourselves to see the past as maybe a lot more exciting and more like us, because I think we're better for it. And it also gives us space to imagine, well, if the past was textured and complicated and just like us, the future probably will be too.
Yeah, as I've learned in Jodo Shinshu, and I guess especially Hongwanji, there's a wide respect for the role of women, in this tradition. And Ashini and Kakushini leading the way, they were in that same mold as
Yaśodharā.
And I think a lot of other kick-ass women throughout history just kept on doing doing it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Anything more on chat? Okay. Well, thank you very, very much, for coming all this way to visit with us. And I don't know, George, you might want to plug our next presentation.
Yeah, so on Sunday, and the time has changed to 7 o'clock, the Hawaii Book and Music Festival is going to be featuring Vanessa at the UH Law School. And I don't think there's an online component to it, so I think it's just in person. So if you want to go to Hawaii Book and Music Festival, look up her event, and then you have to register. So you register and then go to the event. Again, it'll be at the UH Law School at 7 o'clock, from 7 to 8 o'clock. We'll be there from 6:30 to be able to sign books, which will be available for sale. And then from 8 to 8:30, there'll be another chance to purchase the book and to get it autographed by Vanessa. So You're welcome to come. This whole thing came about because last year at the Hawaii Book and Music Festival, which is just online, we did this conversation about Yaśodharā, and Dex and some other people saw it, and they said, we have to get this Vanessa person out here in person. And so lo and behold, here we are. And so Vanessa came. So thank you, Futaba Lecture, for sponsoring her and cooperating with Hawaii Book and Music Festival. And so by doing that, we can feature her twice over this short weekend. So thank you all for coming. And just from my side, let me say thank you to Vanessa. Great storyteller, great presenter. You can see what a wonderful teacher she is. And wouldn't you like to take a class from her? And if you would, go to Montreal.
Thank you so much, everyone. You were a wonderful audience.
So please, you still have a chance to buy her books and get the autograph. She'll be here for as long as it takes to chat with her, and it's a real opportunity. So again, thank you all very much for attending both in person and through Zoom. We have about 20 people, I think, on Zoom, and it's been a delightful evening, very thought-provoking. We don't talk about this part of Buddhism as much during our Shin Buddhist kind of perspectives. So yeah, it was very wonderful and enlightening. Thank you. And we don't know who will be our speaker for the 25th and 25th version of the Futaba Lectures, but stay tuned, and I hope to see you next year.
There's two comments. One from Terry is, thank you very much for very enlightening evening. I can't wait to read your books. Since I'm not there, will they be available at the Honpa bookstore? Okay, yes. And then the other one is from Reverend John Youth. Just excellent, just so much fun and enlightening. Thank you.
Dexter, here you go.